60 sheets of manuscript paper, ink and pigment applied by hand in Milan in the year 1587. When assembled according to their maker's own instructions, they form a circle nearly 10 feet across the largest map of the Earth, produced in the entire 16th century. Stanford University has one. Cartographic historians have studied it. The David Rumsey map collection spent years digitizing every sheet. Geographers have measured its projections, and what they found inside the math of this map stopped them. The projection it uses, placing the North Pole at the center and radiating the continents outward, was not commonly adopted by cartographers until the 20th century. Aerial photography made it necessary. Satellites made it standard. In 1587, there were no satellites, there were no aircraft, and there was no plausible reason to look at the Earth from above the pole. So how is it possible that someone depicted parts of the world that had not yet been explored? This is the story of the 1587 map of Urbano Monte. Milan in 1585 was one of the wealthiest and most intellectually active cities in Europe. Under Spanish rule since 1535, the city had nonetheless maintained its tradition of Renaissance scholarship, a culture where wealthy gentlemen studied astronomy, geography, and natural philosophy not as professions, but as marks of cultivation, the way a nobleman in an earlier century might have studied rhetoric or theology. Urbano Monte belonged to this world completely. His family held status in Milanese society. He had access to libraries, to learned correspondence networks, to the steady stream of travelers, diplomats, and merchants passing through a city that sat at the crossroads of European trade. He was not a professional cartographer in any formal sense. He was something the Renaissance produced in abundance and modernity has largely abandoned. A gentleman's scholar, driven by curiosity rather than commission. Geography was, in this period, the most dynamic field of human knowledge. Every decade brought new coastlines, new continents, new corrections to the classical understanding of the world's shape. Columbus had reached the Americas in 1492. Magellan's crew completed the first circumnavigation of the globe between 1519 and 1522, confirming for European science that the Earth was both round and vastly larger than anyone had calculated. The Portuguese had mapped the African coast. The Spanish were deep into the Americas. Abraham Ortelius had published the first modern world atlas in 1570. Gerardus Mercator had produced his famous navigational projection in 1569. Every educated European in 1585 knew the world was a sphere. The question was how to draw it on a flat surface, a problem that had no perfect solution, only a series of acceptable compromises, each one distorting some aspect of reality to preserve another. Into this environment, in October of 1585, something arrived in Milan that had never happened before. A delegation of 4 young Japanese men stepped off a carriage and into the city's streets. They were the first official Japanese emissaries ever to visit Europe, sent by Christian daimyo in Kyushu under the guidance of Jesuit missionaries traveling through Lisbon, Madrid, Rome, and the major Italian cities as living proof that Japan was open to some degree to the Christian world. Their names were Mansio Ito, Miguel Chijiwa, Martino Hara, and Julian Nakaura. They were teenagers. They had been traveling for 3 years, and when they arrived in Milan, Urbano Monte was there to meet them. What Monte recorded from that encounter the place names, the geographic details, the contours of islands and coastlines that no European had ever accurately described would make his map different from every other Western map of Japan in existence. He began work the following year. In 1586, Monte started drafting what he described as a planisphere, a map of the entire world assembled across 60 individual sheets, designed to be mounted on a 10-foot wooden panel and rotated around a pin fixed at the North Pole. He completed it in 1587, 1 year. 60 sheets, over 1,000 place names, hundreds of illustrated details, animals, rulers, sea creatures, coastlines, drawn from the freshest intelligence available anywhere in Europe. Nobody else ever saw it in its complete assembled form. The sheets were bound together as an atlas and never formally published. They passed through private hands, eventually crossing the Atlantic, until a collector named David Rumsey purchased them and deposited them at Stanford University, where they remained unstudied as a unified whole until 2017, when a team of librarians and historians digitally stitched all 60 sheets together for the first time. What they assembled had been waiting, unread in this form, for 430 years. The moment that digital assembly was complete, the research team at the David Rumsey Map Center stepped back and looked at something nobody had seen as Monte intended since the year it was made. The map is circular. The North Pole sits at the exact center. From it, every continent radiates outward like a flower, opening toward its edges: Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, all proportionally plotted at their correct angular distances from the pole. The further from the center, the more distorted the landmasses become, stretching toward the southern edges of the circle in the way that any projection from a fixed point necessarily warps the extremities. This is called an azimuthal equidistant projection. It preserves accurate distances and directions from the central point in this case, the pole, at the cost of distorting shape and area the further you move from it. The projection is sound. The mathematics behind it are not improvised. Monte understood and correctly applied the geometric principles necessary to construct it, working without computers, without aerial photography, without any external reference point from which the Earth could actually be seen from above. The researchers checked the mathematics. The projection was executed with a consistency that surprised them. Monte hadn't estimated or approximated his way through 60 sheets. He had calculated. There is a clear explanation for the choice of projection, and it is the one Monte himself provided. He wanted to show the entire world as if looking down from directly above the pole, because this was the only way to fit every continent onto a single circular sheet without cutting any of them in half. It was a problem of representation, solved by a man who understood geometry well enough to construct the solution by hand. What the explanation does not address is the accuracy of what that projection then revealed. The outline of Antarctica presents the first pause. In 1587, Antarctica had not been discovered. The continent's existence would not be confirmed until 1820, when the Russian expedition of Fabian von Bellingshausen first sighted its coastline. Yet at the southern rim of Monte's map, there is a continuous landmass surrounding the circle, labeled in Latin as a speculative region Terra Australis. The great southern continent that classical geography had always predicted must exist to counterbalance the weight of the northern landmasses. This is not mysterious in itself. The idea of Terra Australis was centuries old. Every major world map of the period included some version of it. Mercator had drawn it, Ortelius had drawn it. It was a theoretical prediction, not a discovery. What slows researchers down is not the presence of the southern landmass, but its shape in specific sections, and the way the overall geometry of the map positions it relative to verified coastlines above it. The question, and it remains a question, not a conclusion, is whether Monte placed Terra Australis in roughly the right position by accident, by classical prediction that happened to approximate reality, or by some source of information that hasn't been traced. The Japan section produces a cleaner mystery and a cleaner answer, though the answer itself opens another door. Every Western map of Japan produced in the 16th century contains the same basic errors. The islands are oriented incorrectly. Coastline proportions are wrong. The relationship between the main island and the smaller surrounding ones is distorted in ways that reflect European reliance on second-hand written accounts rather than direct survey data. Monte's map of Japan is different. The orientation is more accurate. The proportions are closer to correct. And the map contains Japanese place names written phonetically in the Latin alphabet that appear on no other Western European map of the period. The explanation, once researchers identified it, is specific and documented. Monte met the Japanese delegation in Milan in 1585. He spoke with them directly. He recorded what they told him about their home islands, with a precision that no one working only from published sources could have achieved. This is not anomalous. It is exactly what a careful scholar with access to primary sources would do. But it confirms something important about how the map was made. Monte had access to information networks that did not exist in the formal published record of his time. He was mining private conversations, unpublished accounts, and diplomatic encounters that left no other trace in European cartography. Which raises the question that nobody has fully answered. If he had privileged access to Japanese geographic knowledge through a personal encounter that no other cartographer shared, what other sources fed into the 60 sheets? What other conversations, private letters, unpublished expedition records, or diplomatic intelligence made their way into a map that was never published, never circulated, and sat unassembled for 4 centuries? The map as it stands cannot answer that question. Monte left no notes identifying his sources beyond the map's own margins. The full library of records he consulted, if one ever existed as a coherent collection, has not survived. What remains is the map itself, 60 sheets of evidence pointing to a mind with access to more information than the published record of 1587 can account for. The part of Monte's map that researchers return to most often and argue about most seriously is not Antarctica. It is the projection itself, and what executing that projection correctly in 1587 actually required. An azimuthal equidistant projection centered on the North Pole is not guesswork. It requires knowing, with reasonable accuracy, the latitudes and longitudes of every major geographic feature being plotted. Longitude, in particular, was the great unsolved problem of 16th century navigation. Latitude, your distance from the equator, could be measured by observing the sun or stars at midday, a technique mariners had used for centuries. Longitude, your position east or west on the globe, had no reliable method of measurement until the invention of accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century. This meant that every world map made before roughly 1750 carried systematic longitude errors. Coastlines were compressed or stretched horizontally. Islands appeared too close to or too far from continents. The further a region was from Europe, the larger the accumulated errors tended to become. Monte's map contains longitude errors. Researchers documenting it have been careful to note this. It is not a modern accuracy map. What it is, within the context of 16th century cartography, is unusually consistent, meaning that its errors, where they exist, follow a systematic pattern rather than the scattered, random inaccuracies that come from simply copying whatever source material was available without understanding how the sources fit together. Dr. Catherine Parker, whose 2018 paper in Imago Mundi remains the most thorough scholarly examination of Monte's projection, describes his approach as reflecting a genuine geometric intelligence applied to the problem of representing a sphere on a plane, not a perfect solution, but a methodologically coherent one that most of his contemporaries were not attempting at this scale. What Parker and others have not been able to resolve is the source question. Specifically, the Philippines appear on Monte's map with a level of geographic detail and a number of place names that exceed what was available in any published European source in 1587. The Spanish had been establishing a colonial presence in the Philippine archipelago since 1565. And by 1587 Manila was a functioning colonial capital. But the cartographic data from Spanish Pacific voyages was not freely shared. Spain and Portugal had a formal agreement, the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world between their respective spheres of exploration and trade, and geographic intelligence was a state secret, jealously guarded and deliberately withheld from rival powers and publishers. The fact that Monte, a private Milanese scholar with no official connection to either Spanish or Portuguese colonial administration, produced a Philippine section that goes beyond what other contemporary cartographers could access raises a question that historians of cartography have raised but not answered. What was his source? One serious hypothesis, advanced informally by several researchers though never published as a formal claim, is that Monte had access to unpublished Spanish expedition records through the Italian networks that connected Milanese commerce to Iberian colonial trade. Milan, under Spanish rule, was not geographically isolated from the Spanish imperial information system. Merchants, administrators, and Jesuit missionaries moved between the two worlds regularly, and Jesuit networks in particular had produced some of the most detailed geographic surveys of Asia that Europe possessed in this period's surveys that were not published but circulated in manuscript form within the order. This is a hypothesis. The documentary evidence that would confirm it, a specific letter, a named source, a traceable transfer of cartographic data from a Spanish or Jesuit record to Monte's workshop has not been found. A second layer of the map that rarely receives attention involves Monte's treatment of the Arctic. Rather than following Mercator's influential 1569 depiction of 4 distinct landmasses symmetrically arranged around the North Pole, a model based on classical theory, and widely accepted by Monte's contemporaries, Monte drew an open polar sea. At the time, this was a minority position. Mercator's 4 landmass Arctic was the standard image. Monte rejected it. The open polar sea is, as far as researchers can determine, correct. The Arctic Ocean is not divided by polar landmasses. Monte's Arctic, stripped of its speculative elements, more closely resembles the actual geography of the polar region than the dominant model of his day. Whether this reflects access to information from northern voyages Dutch and English expeditions were probing the Arctic in the 1580s, searching for a northeastern passage to Asia, or whether it reflects Monte's own theoretical reasoning about why a polar landmass was geographically unlikely, the record does not say. What the record does say is that he was right, in a period when most of his peers were wrong, about a geographic feature nobody had definitively observed. The self-portrait adds a small, strange coda. Pasted onto one of the 60 sheets is a cutout illustration of Monte himself, dated 1589, 2 years after the map's completion. Lift that pasted illustration, and beneath it is a second self-portrait, dated 1587. Monte updated his own image on the map. He returned to it, revised it, continued thinking about it. A man who worked on something nobody else was going to see, applying corrections to his own face inside a manuscript nobody was assembling. What he was still working toward, and why, the map cannot say. There is a peculiar category of historical object, the thing made with extraordinary effort and intelligence, for an audience that never came. Monte's map was never published. No printer produced copies. No atlas included it. No navigator carried it. No library cataloged it in a form that made it accessible to subsequent generations of cartographers. It influenced nothing that can be traced. The innovations it contained, the polar projection, the Japanese detail, the open Arctic, arrived in mainstream cartography only later, through independent development, without reference to Monte's work. This is not unusual for the period. The manuscript publishing world of the late Renaissance was not a meritocracy of good ideas. What circulated was what got printed, and what got printed depended on commercial viability, patronage relationships, and the willingness of powerful institutions above all the Catholic Church and the Iberian crowns to permit publication. A private Milanese scholar working outside any formal institutional framework had no obvious path to print distribution, and a 10-foot map requiring a 10-foot wooden panel to display would have been commercially impractical regardless. But the silence of the historical record around Monte himself deepens the strangeness. He is not a minor figure who left a small footprint. He produced the largest manuscript map of Earth made in the 16th century. He demonstrated mathematical and geographic abilities that his contemporaries were not applying at this scale. And yet almost nothing is known about his life beyond what the map itself contains. His name, his approximate dates of activity, the fact that he met the Japanese delegation in 1585, and the existence of a second self-portrait suggesting he returned to the map at least once after completing it. No correspondence has been identified. No other works are securely attributed to him. No record of where he studied, whom he knew outside the Japanese encounter, what library he used, or what happened to him after 1589, when the second self-portrait was dated, has survived in a form that historians have located. He is, in practical terms, nearly invisible, present only in the map itself, a single enormous artifact that absorbed years of his attention and then disappeared into a private collection for 4 centuries. The 2017 digitization by the David Rumsey Map Center changed the map's accessibility completely. A site indexed Teskurs 10, 1 until 2017, the 60 individual sheets had only ever been viewed separately, n/site. Assembling them digitally for the first time allowed researchers to see Monte's unified projection as he intended it, and the high-resolution scans made every detail of every sheet available for study in a way that was simply impossible when the sheets were bound in an atlas. This has already produced new findings. The multispectral imaging has allowed researchers to distinguish between ink layers, identifying at least some areas where Monte made corrections or additions after the initial drawing. The Japanese section, in particular, shows signs of revision consistent with information being refined rather than transcribed in a single session, suggesting Monte returned to specific areas of the map as new information became available to him, rather than completing it as a single fixed document. What the digitization cannot provide is the archival record that would explain the sources. The map's geography can be analyzed down to individual coastline segments. The math of its projection can be checked against modern geodetic standards. The place names can be compared against every known contemporary source. But the chain of information transfer the specific people, letters, meetings, or documents that fed Monte's knowledge of the Philippines, the Arctic, or the shape of the Southern Ocean remains untraced, because the paper trail that would document it either never existed in a recoverable form or has not yet been found. Researchers working on the map today are following two parallel tracks. One involves systematic comparison of Monte's place names against the unpublished Jesuit geographic records held in the Archivum Romanum Societatis Iesu in Rome, a vast archive of manuscript correspondence and survey data from Jesuit missionaries across Asia and the Americas, much of which has never been fully indexed or cross-referenced with 16th century cartography. The hypothesis is that some of Monte's anomalous geographic detail traces back to Jesuit manuscript sources he had access to through the order's presence in Milan. The other track involves the map's projection mathematics. A geodesist named John Hessler at the Library of Congress has been among the researchers examining whether the consistency of Monte is azimuthal. Equidistant projection implies access to a more comprehensive set of latitude and longitude measurements than were available in published sources, and if so, where those measurements came from. Neither track has produced a definitive answer. Both remain active. The map sits in digital form now, fully assembled, visible to anyone. Every coastline, every place name, every painted sea monster and illustrated ruler is available for examination. And the central question, what did this man know and where did it come from, remains exactly as open as it was the morning the digitization team stepped back and looked at the whole for the first time. There is a specific kind of knowledge that leaves no explanation behind it. Monte's map contains accuracies that exceed what the published record of 1587 can account for. It uses a projection that was not standard practice for another 3 centuries. It records geographic detail about Japan, the Philippines, and the Arctic that its maker could only have obtained through channels the surviving documents do not describe. And then it disappeared bound into an atlas, carried across an ocean, stored in a private collection, and never consulted by the cartographic tradition that came after it. The mystery of this map is not about lost civilizations or suppressed knowledge or forces working against human understanding. It is quieter than that, and in some ways more disorienting. It is about a single careful mind in Renaissance Milan, working for years on a document of extraordinary ambition and precision for an audience that never materialized, in a form that made the work inaccessible even when people were looking for it. What Monte knew, he knew in 1587. Whatever sources gave him that knowledge were available, at least to him, in 1587. And then, the sources closed. The people he spoke to died. The letters he received, if they survived at all, passed into archives that haven't been fully searched. The map itself sat folded into 60 sheets for 430 years before anyone saw what it looked like whole. This is what makes it different from a mystery built on destruction or concealment. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was burned. The 60 sheets were simply never assembled. The information was there. The access was never created. Every historical mystery eventually resolves into one of two questions. Was the knowledge lost, or was it never transmitted? Monte's map suggests a third possibility, more ordinary and in some ways more troubling than either. The knowledge was made. It was complete. It sat in a room, waiting to be looked at correctly for longer than most nations have existed. Some things are not hidden. They are simply waiting for the right angle of view.